Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we are still in the month of
Diablos.
And wait, do you hear that? What's that? Oh right, that's episode 40! We got episode 40. That is a lot of episodes. I cannot even explain how insane that is to me. But hey, we're almost a third of the way through, which is pretty crazy to think about. Anyway, thank you all for supporting my endeavors with subscribing, sharing. Even if you're just watching the series, it means more to me than you could ever know. But, you know, enough with the sappy talk, let's get down to business. This time we're going to be revisiting our Summoner series with Summons Part 3. Here we're going to talk about 3 more summons and their origins in the real world and how they're depicted within the Final Fantasy franchise at large. But first, let's talk about our initial job of this video, and it's going to be about the Geomancer. The Geomancer is another fairly underutilized job in the franchise, much like the Time Mage that I listed in my last video. Here though, I think Geomancer is more of a C tier class in terms of how frequent it appears in games. You could make an argument for maybe a low B tier. So the Geomancer is a really unique class in that they depend entirely on the element and environment around them. Using their geomancy abilities, they have the power to access different kinds of spells randomly depending on what terrain they're fighting from. So they're unreliable in that sense, but they can be devastating in certain areas. It's kind of a toss-up really. Their garb, which is what they wear, kind of looks like sleeping clothes with bells on them, which is weird, but yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. Anyway, alright. Let's get on with our summons of the video. Today we're going to talk about 3 more, like I said, and this time we're going to talk about the summon of the month, of course, Diablos. We're going to talk about Carbuncle, and then we're going to talk about Gilgamesh, which has only been a summon once, but we'll talk about him a little bit more. So some of these are very iconic in the series, and they may not all appear as summons in general, maybe like Gilgamesh, but they are very iconic nonetheless. So let's go ahead and start off with Diablos, and I'm not going to do the crazy little voice whatever, that's... I'll spare you. You can thank me later. Diablos appears in Final Fantasy 6 and 8 as summons, and in other games as enemies as well, such as 11, 12, and 12 Revenant Wings. He appears as a concept art of Fal'Cie in Final Fantasy 13, but he never actually appears in the game itself. He also appears in 14 as a boss, Type 0 as an Eidolon, and other games that are related to Final Fantasy like Bravely Default, Final Fantasy Dimensions, Legends 2, not Legend 2, but Legends 2, Vic Logica, Airborne Brigade, Record Keeper, Brave Exvius, World of Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy Mobius, Explorers, and in the trading card game. And that is a lot more than I thought that he was in, actually. So normally Diablos takes the form of a classic demon or devil, Satan I guess, from modern Christian mythology, horned winged terror, I'm sure you all know the drill. He doesn't use fire, as you might think, maybe from a Christian hell kind of point of view, but what he does use is gravity-based attacks, so these darkness attacks. And while gravity attacks can do a lot of damage, they're normally based on the percentage of health that you have. So I can't say for certain, but in my experience, most people are aware of him from Final Fantasy VIII, where you can actually fight him as an optional boss after you're given the magic lamp from Cid, and if you defeat him, you can actually get him as a guardian force to summon him later. And he does this dark messenger attack. It's like I said, a gravity-based attack, and it's based on a percentage of your level. Yeah, he's not one that you may want to summon very often, but his animation, especially in Final Fantasy VIII, they really did a bunch of stuff with the animations. It's really cool. So we'll get away from Diablo for a little bit and actually talk about pretty much the most extreme opposite thing in reference for Diablo, at least in cuteness, and that's going to be Carbuncle. And Carbuncle appears in many Final Fantasy games from 5 on. And he's usually a helper kind of character, maybe a summon of some sort, or in some cases he has appeared as an enemy. So Carbuncle appears in Final Fantasy 5, 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, 14, Tactics, Tactics Advanced, Tactics A2, Defenders W2, Legends 2, not Legend 2, Legends, Dissidia, Airborne Brigade, Record Keeper, Brave Exvius, Mobius, World of Final Fantasy. Whew. as a summon of some sort. Most recently, though, he's appeared in Final Fantasy XV's demo as sort of a guide to introduce you to the game and maybe get a little bit of backstory on Noctis as a child, in fact. And if you complete the demo, you can actually get him in the full proper Final Fantasy XV game. Otherwise, he appears in just about every other Square game after Final Fantasy V in some form or another, even if it's just an Easter egg. Most of the time, though, when he does appear as a summon, he's usually going to appear in some cute way, and I'm thinking right now in Final Fantasy VIII terms. And he usually casts Reflect on the party or something that is generally going to help you out in some way. Very rarely does Carbuncle actually have an attack. He's not really an attack summon, save for Final Fantasy XIV, where Carbuncle is actually your main primary summon for the Arcanist. So his name is pretty interesting whenever we're talking about a kind of real-world origin here. Carbuncle seems to refer to a fiery red colored jewel, and from my research, I found out that around the 13th century from French Latin origin, it comes from this Carbuncle word. You may notice something in there, char. Basically, it's coal, right? However, this was really short-lived. It actually started being used to be applied to things like tumors and abscesses and general red inflammation spots on your body. And that is pretty much the exact opposite of what Carbuncle appears as in the Final Fantasy games. Carbuncle, he's usually a very light-colored turquoise, rabbity kind of creature, just some, this ball of cuteness. But again, beware looking at the pictures when searching outside of the Final Fantasy realm. It is not a pretty sight. Alright, so last up we have a pretty big one that I wanted to talk about. And he probably could have had his own episode by himself, but I'm putting him here anyway because this is Final Fantasy V, and he's introduced here in a major way. Last up, we have the big one, and that is Gilgamesh. And this one's super, super interesting to talk about. So I'm going to switch it up here, and I'd like to talk about Gilgamesh within real-world literature before I tell you, what games he's in and stuff like that. So for those that don't know, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the earliest written works of a story told ever, like ever. I learned about it in college. And just as an aside, you may have been told that Beowulf was the earliest epic poem, and that is true just in the sense that it is the earliest poem written in a modern Latin or European language, but Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, actually did come first. Just sit back, you're going to learn just a little bit about what that epic was, the story behind it, because it does play into Final Fantasy quite a bit. In fact, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes of the Cliff Notes version. He was a great Sumerian king, and these gods sent down a feral creature person named Enkidu, and basically they did that to keep Gilgamesh in check, because Gilgamesh was just this crazy, overzealous, powerful king that wanted to do all this stuff. So they sent down a being that would rival him, and actually they kind of just fought, and then they became friends, basically. And eventually the story goes on, and Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is quite affected by this, and he goes off to find eternal life. And in many of the ways that mythology does this, especially with Achilles, Gilgamesh did in fact find eternal life, or at least eternal enough, because here we are right now still talking about him. So he has lived on in the memory. And that's very important, being that this is the first big story that was ever written down by humanity. Now, that's like I said, Cliff Notes of the Cliff Notes version. Go read it yourself, it's really good. But it's actually not the end of Gilgamesh. Well, the Final Fantasy incarnation of Gilgamesh. So alongside that Sumerian king epic, we also have this Japanese mythos called Benkei, B-E-N-K-E-I, who was also said to be a great warrior monk. And he had overwhelming strength. And what happened with him is that he stood watch on a bridge, and he challenged all these warriors that wanted to cross this bridge, and he was never defeated, save for one time. But his goal was to collect just all of these weapons. In the particular version I found, he wants to collect 1,000 weapons. And if you know anything about Gilgamesh in Final Fantasy, you'll know exactly where this comes into play. So now actually moving over to the Final Fantasy realm, Gilgamesh is a recurring character beginning in Final Fantasy V. Obviously, it's the reason I chose to talk about him this month, and I mentioned that at the beginning of the video, I think. He takes just about every role in a story that you could possibly imagine, actually. He's an antagonist, he's an ally, he's a summon, he's there for comic relief. Pretty much, he fits in somewhere in the story wherever he can, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it. And as I was going and kind of researching all of this, I found that Gilgamesh supposedly is the character or thing from Final Fantasy that appears the most in the franchise. Like Gilgamesh, that single entity, that idea of Gilgamesh, he appears in more Final Fantasy things than any other kind of Final Fantasy thing, save for like the title of Final Fantasy itself. And I thought that was actually really interesting. Now, I'm not going to list all the games that he's been in because my hard drive is only 2 terabytes big, and just take as a base fact that he's probably in some way, shape, or form any Final Fantasy game that you're gonna play, whether you know that or not. In the games where he does appear in, he's usually clad with red and is looking for weapons, and that goes back to that Benki story that we talked about. He's always searching for more and more weapons. And in many games where he is the comic relief, which is actually quite a bit, in Final Fantasy V even, he's looking for this massive holy sword, this Excalibur, obviously King Arthur Legends, but as a comic relief, usually wields his sword called the Excalibur, just like a play on word, pun, I guess. But that's, one of his swords. It's kind of a staple, like, Gilgamesh, he has his crappy sword. Anyway, in Final Fantasy VIII, he appears as a random summon in probably the most epic of ways. I can tell you that Gilgamesh is not my favorite summon, that belongs to another, but this particular scene, how he shows up, is the best summoning scene introduction ever. Let's just watch it because it's too good to pass up. So is that not one of the most badass things you've ever seen? Basically, what's happened, if you're not familiar with Final Fantasy VIII, there's a summon called Odin, and Odin appears randomly from time to time, and when he appears and attacks, he just kills stuff instantly. Like, he's the most powerful summon in the game, for all intents and purposes. But, whenever Squall is fighting his adversary here, Odin shows up, and you're like, oh my god, this is so awesome. And, he gets destroyed utterly, and then, hey, look, Gilgamesh got that weapon he was looking for. Anyway, I think that's where I'm going to stop it there. Our next video, actually, in the month of Diablos, is going to be our Job Series Part 4. And we'll catch up with a bunch of classes over there, but until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.